Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast, episode 45. My name is Mark Moncrief from Upon Hope, and today I'm going to talk about liberalism, and as the title suggests, how we are all marinated in liberalism. But before I get to that, I wanted to talk about just bizarre things that it's interesting, the difference between my blog and YouTube. My blog is Upon Hope, and one of the articles that has really risen to prominence in recent times is an article that I wrote on come on, where are you? I'm looking at the computer screen at the same time as I'm talking. What is more important, the past, the present, or the future? And it's a very well-written article, I have to say. And it was written back in 2014, so it's 6 years old. And in the last month, it's had about 160 views on my blog. And that means that it's about double the number 2 article, which I wrote this month, or last month. So it's quite prominent. Anyway, so on YouTube, it's been up for about a week, and it's got 9 views. Now, what makes it particularly stick out is that the day before, Why the Domestic Violence Industry Will Fail, has 21 views, and the one a day after, Constitutional Monarchy, has 22 views. So even in that 3-day span, it sticks out as being well below average. But on my blog, it's well above average, performing very, very well. So it's just very strange, very strange. Anyway, so let's talk about liberalism. First we'll talk about what liberalism is. And liberalism is always portrayed as something that's very positive. It is the defining political philosophy of our lives. We have spent our entire lives under liberalism. And so did our parents and our grandparents. And it's probably true that their grandparents also spent their entire lives under liberalism. It is by far the dominant political philosophy in the world, and it believes that it will one day dominate the world. So what is liberalism? Well, the very first use of the word liberalism comes about in the 1300s, and it refers to a liberal education. Now, in the 1300s, most university education, that's what we're talking about, was church-based. So theology was the centre around which all learning took place. And a liberal education said, sure, theology is important, but we'll also look at other subjects as well. They're also important. And over time, it came to dominate. Those other subjects came to dominate, and theology was cast aside. But in a political sense, liberalism is first used, that I know of, in 1769. And in that year when it's recorded, it's obvious that it means exactly the same thing that we understand it to mean. It's about liberty, it's about freedom. Now, when you look at the history of the English-speaking world, you see that liberalism really came to achieve prominence at the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And from that time, liberalism is completely in charge. It has no rivals, no serious rivals anyway. And that means that from that time, the 1688, till today, we have lived under liberalism in one shape or another, because liberalism is a progressive philosophy. So that means that it's constantly changing. It can't stay in the same place. It can't become old-fashioned. And in fact, that's one of the defining features of our civilization, is that we love the new. Everything has to be new. So, what's the latest movie at the cinema? What's the newest song on the music charts? What's the latest art? And it doesn't matter whether those things are good or bad. What matters is that they're new. That's what gives them importance. And in other civilizations, that's not true. I'll give an example of Asia. In Asia, once an art form begins to develop, then it seeks perfection. And once it is accepted that an art form has reached perfection, then the job of anyone coming afterwards is simply to emulate the masters, because you can't surpass them. It's impossible. They've reached perfection. You can't do better than perfection. And what we say is no, you can just do more. Be original. Originality is prized over perfection. So liberalism is about freedom, as the name suggests. It's about liberty. And the first thing that they were really concerned with was having control over property, that your property was your property. And actually, that's a very important thing. I think that that's one thing that we probably have taken from liberalism that we probably wouldn't have, traditionalism, which we probably wouldn't have otherwise. But that was a very important thing. Another was that a man's home is his castle, that he is dominant within his home. Now, that is a traditional English philosophy. In fact, I would go further and say that it's one of the mainstays of the pre-modern world, that what you did in your home, that was your domain. You were sovereign in your home. When you went out into the street and started to do things, then you were not sovereign. Then you found out that other people were sovereign. And just as liberalism is constantly progressing and changing, it has an end goal, and that end goal is the autonomous individual. Now, to get to the autonomous individual, what you have to do is you have to make people free. So you have to free people from the things that are holding them back. And traditionally, that is traditionalism. That's the things that hold people back. So a class system, you have to really get rid of the class system and proclaim a classless society. People have to be able to move according to their abilities up and down the social ladder. You can't have institutions that hold people back. You can't have money that hold people back. People have to be able to attain these things on their own merit. That's what classical liberalism said, and now it's starting to change as classical liberalism has broken up into left liberalism and right liberalism. But on the whole, it's about always obtaining more and more freedom. And the autonomous individual is, as I said, the end point of liberalism. Not every liberal really understands this, and they can be quite shocked when they actually do hear it. But it's really saying that the autonomous individual is someone who is completely self-made. And that's something you do hear in the history of liberalism. You hear about the self-made man. And the autonomous individual is the ultimate self-made man. And that's why things like transgenderism are such a... You would think they would get a lot more opposition in liberalism, but actually it really defines what liberalism is in a way, because someone who's transgender, who chooses to change their very sex, their very biology, that's the ultimate freedom, because they've made themselves. And the fact that they suffer from a mental illness is apparently not something you're supposed to notice, but But liberalism says that, creating yourself is the greatest thing that you can do. And that's the ultimate goal of the autonomous individual. We'll come back to the autonomous individual later. But one thing that's also been very important in liberalism is free trade. So free trade encompasses three main areas. It encompasses the free movement of goods. It encompasses the free movement of capital, which means money. And it encompasses the free movement of labour, which we usually call immigration. Now, all of those things should be, under liberalism, be able to move about as they see fit. And we go back 50 years and you see that actually there were a lot of tariffs. There are a lot of controls on money and controls on people's movements. But that was sort of an aberration. And it lasted for a long time. It lasted for about 60 years. But you go back to before the First World War and all of these things were taking place. And then there's this big gap in the middle where real life effectively gets in the way. The two world wars, the depressions, the effects of those. But eventually those lessons are put aside and liberals say, hey, we want to return to our original objective. We've got off track here. We want to return to a world where goods can move freely, where money can move freely, and where labour can move freely. And so that's the world we are in today, that globalised world, where all those things are moving about. But there's also another thing that occasionally we hear about, but we don't quite understand what's going on. We hear the conflict between liberalism and religion. And liberalism basically says, although liberalism came out of Protestantism, and if you go back into liberalism, you'll hear a lot of liberal arguments being made in a religious vein. But gradually God has been pushed out. And that's the logic of liberalism. Because ultimately, if man can make himself into anything he wants, then he doesn't really need God. So man becomes God. But we'll talk about the limitations of that later when I come back to talk about the autonomous individual. Now, liberalism is all around us. We're just bathing in it. And our entire life is lived under it. There's no point where we have not been influenced by liberalism. And this is one of the things that people on our side can often forget. We struggle against liberalism. We notice the problems of liberalism. And we often say to ourselves, hey, I reject that. But we forget that so much of liberalism is already inside of us. And often we don't know it. We don't realise it. We don't accept it. But we need to. We need to understand that we haven't escaped from this battlefield. We have scars and wounds. And some of those wounds are very superficial and some of them are very, very deep. And you can sometimes hear yourself arguing for what are not traditional positions, but are quite frankly liberal ones. We pick up these attitudes and we spread them. One of the things that you'll hear quite commonly is people say, oh, I'm a conservative, I'm as conservative as you can get. And they'll say, oh, of course free trade is great. And the fact that it attacks their own people, sometimes their own livelihood, seems to pass them by because they're so enamoured, they're so not enamored, marinated in liberalism that they haven't even realised. They've let other people do their thinking. Another thing that people, I don't know what the right word is, forget or maybe don't notice, is that one of the keys that liberalism has is it portrays itself as being nice. It's the nice option. So if you're not choosing the liberal path, then you're not a nice person. And if you're not a nice person, then you're not a good person. And of course, that's nonsense. But a lot of us fall for it. And, sometimes I will be watching a TV program, for example, or a movie, and I'm waiting for the character to say the nice thing. And when they don't, I'm like, what does this mean for the plot? Because often it does mean something. But that also takes place in real life. We're out and we're having a conversation with somebody, and somebody says something that is, quote, not nice, and we react to it. Because, again, we're just so used to it. And we really have to be on guard against that. And one of the things that is very common, in fact, I think it's true for nearly everyone, is that we let other people do our thinking for us. And, life's complex. You've got things you have to do. You have to go to work, you have to go to school, you have to get by. And you can't spend all your time just thinking about things. And when you do think about things, you often find that it really hurts. It hurts your brain and it hurts your life. So instead of doing that, maybe it's better to let other people do your thinking for you. And that way, you can just watch the news and find out what you're supposed to think. This is very, very common. And I know all of you have noticed this in other people, but we have to watch out for it ourselves, because this is a trap that we also fall for. Now, talking about another trap that we fall for, some people fall for, is something called the third way. Now, I've talked in the past about what left and right wing mean, and I'll go through that again. At the French Revolution, those who supported the king sat to the right of the speaker, and those who supported the revolution sat to the left, and that's where the term left and right wing come from. We are right wing. Traditionalists are right wing. Now, about 1900, somewhere around there, left and right actually changed meaning. And what they came to mean is that if you support socialism, then you're on the left. And if you oppose socialism, then you're on the right. So pro-socialist is left wing, anti-socialist is right wing. Well, even by that definition, we're still right wing. So a third position, or a third way, is something that says, hey, we don't have to take this left-right view. There's another way, a third way. And you might be surprised by some of the different things that have been called third way. Baathism, which is what Saddam Hussein had, and in Syria they have. The IRA called themselves third way. Juice, which is the North Korean philosophy. Nasserism, which was what Nasser in Egypt called his movement. National Bolshevism, the Iron Guard, the British Union of Fascists. Even the Nazis called themselves a third way. Fascism said that they were a third way between communism and traditionalism. The PLO says that they're a third way. The Third Internationalists, which are communists, they said that they were a third way. Strasserism, SNP, Phalangism, and one that's a modern one is Duginism from Russia. These are all things that are called third way, and we're not third way. We are right wing. Traditionalists are right wing. And if you're not right wing, then you're not a traditionalist. And if you're a traditionalist, you have to be right wing. I can't put it any clearer. So why do we oppose liberalism? Because we should oppose liberalism. Well, the first thing is that freedom is not what liberalism says it is. Liberalism says that freedom is being able to do what you want, but that's not freedom. What freedom is not being a slave. And that is literal, figurative, and metaphysical. So if you are addicted to drugs, you're not a free man, you're a slave. If you are an alcoholic, you're not a free man, you're a slave. If you are constantly thinking about about your next sexual partner, and you spend a great deal of thought on that, then you're also not a free man, you're a slave. And if you are obsessed, no matter what the obsession is about, then you are not a free man, you are a slave. That's what freedom means. It means being free from your base nature, because we do have a base nature. We have a part of us that wants to dominate us and wants to make us a slave to its will. So there's nothing wrong with having a drink, but being an alcoholic is another thing. There's nothing wrong with feeling lust, but letting it consume you is another thing. There's nothing wrong with having an interest, but being consumed by it, obsessed with it, is a entirely different thing. And liberalism says that no, it's not. If you want to use drugs, then you're free to do that. If you want to drink to excess, then you're free to do that. If you want to obsess over whatever, then you are free to do that. So the basic meaning of freedom under liberalism is completely different to the definition of freedom under traditionalism. Now, free movement. Free movement sounds like a good thing. You know, that people can move around, that goods can move around, money and so forth. But again, everything has a price, and liberalism does not acknowledge that at all. Liberalism says that everything is a benefit simply because it's happening. And we say, no, let's look at what this actually costs us. So having the free movement of goods means that Australia doesn't have a car industry anymore, which means it doesn't have the capability to make heavy vehicles here. It doesn't have any of those skills. And everything costs more because it has to come from overseas. And whether that is good or bad quality, we have to put up with it. So another thing that we've seen recently is medicine, and how much medicine that we need comes from China. Something like 95%. It's absurd. There is an enormous cost, but liberalism says, what cost? So we're totally against that free movement, because everything has a price. Everything. Nothing is free. And liberalism says it doesn't matter. But liberalism is also very destructive. And liberalism, it loves that destructiveness. It's one of the things that many people actually find appealing about it. And it's destructive to the individual, because the individual needs to fit in. That's something fundamentally different, again, between liberalism and traditionalism. Liberalism says that people should be free, again, to do as they want. But traditionalism says people don't want to be free. People want boundaries. They want to know what's right and wrong. And they want, ultimately, to belong. That is the great desire that people have. They want a place where they fit in, a place where they're valued, all right? So they might dream of 30 sexual partners, but really what's best for them is one permanent sexual partner, a husband or a wife. And their desire is less important. And liberalism says no, desire is most important. And that appeal to your base nature is something that hurts people. And we see it in our own lives. We see people that we know, that we care about. We even see it directly in our own lives. We see that, being able to be sexually adventurous has a price. And we're not told about that price. And then all of a sudden we realise, wow, this is quite costly. And not just about sex, but relationships. We want to be loved, and we want to love. That's very hard when people are disposable. And that's the society that we live in, where people are disposable. It's destructive of the family. I mean, it's hard to think of anything more destructive to the family in the entire history of the family than no-fault divorce. I can't think of anything that has caused more devastation, more destruction than no-fault divorce. But again, in liberalism, it's totally logical. If it's all about choice, and if you choose to be married, then it's a good choice. And if you choose to be unmarried, then that's a good choice. And it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, it matters that you made a choice. And traditionalism says that's absurd, and we shouldn't give any credence to that at all. It's destructive of the nation. Mass immigration is held up as this great thing that has so many benefits. But actually, I don't think it has any benefits at all. I think everything that is given to us as a benefit, or that we're told is a benefit, is actually bad. Today on my way here, I pulled out of my driveway and I saw a woman in a burqa walk past. I mean, you can imagine how thrilled I was. These things are not of benefit to me at all. And I don't see them being a benefit to anyone. I see that everything is being destroyed so that we can live up to an ideal. And the ideal is that everyone should be free to live wherever they want. And quite frankly, I'm really, really sick of it. And here we come back to the autonomous individual. The purpose of the autonomous individual is that everyone is self-made. Everyone is able to do whatever they want. But actually, that's not quite true. Because when liberalism obtains this goal, it will have to have destroyed everything else that holds back the autonomous individual. So there can't be anything like churches, because they give it a rival morality, and liberalism will not tolerate that. And we can see that already. It does not tolerate it. It won't put up with the family. The family, again, is something that holds people back according to liberalism. You can't make yourself if you're held to a standard. So the family has to be destroyed. And we can see it being destroyed right in front of our eyes. Will businesses exist? I'm not quite sure. But I could certainly see a world where there were no businesses, where in reality they were all controlled by the government. And it is the government that ultimately will be the big winner, because the jobs that the churches did, that the family did, they still have to be done. So who will do those? The government will do those. So all those things that the autonomous individual needs will be provided by the government. So the government will be your employer. It will be your parent. It will be everything to you. So you will not be free. You will absolutely be a slave. And you might not be called a slave, and you might be able to point to all these wonderful experiences that you could have, but in the end, all you will have is your base nature, and that makes you a slave. So I hope you found this of interest, and I think that I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I will see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.